In the 4th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, we read the story of the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. According to Matthew, his ministry begins with Jesus gathering disciples. We read about 2 sets of brothers that Jesus calls. They're all fishermen. When Jesus calls to them, they follow immediately. They leave their nets, they drop their gear, they follow right away. Some people kind of speculate. They must have seen Jesus perform a miracle or must have known something about him before that. We don't know. Matthew doesn't tell us. Here's what I think. I think that Matthew tells a story to communicate to us as gospel hearers that following Jesus isn't something we can just dabble in. It's like that old cliche about how you can't be a little bit pregnant. You either are or you aren't. Now, according to the Urban Dictionary, they actually talk about that cliche, believe it or not. And according to the Urban Dictionary, they say that that cliche reveals that certain situations are binary. They either are or they aren't. You can't be a little bit of certain things. And discipleship is one of them. You either are a disciple or you're not. If you're in, you got to be all in. But even if we make up our minds and fully commit to following Jesus, another challenge presents itself. Sometimes it's hard to know where Jesus is leading us. Sometimes it's hard to pick out the voice of God. We live in a culture that is so noisy and distracting. There are so many voices around us. Most people are happy to talk at us, more so than listen. There's not a lot of silence in our culture. We get lots of perspectives from different people, competing voices. Plenty of people would like to tell us what to believe and where to go. But how do we follow Jesus in the midst of all of that? How can we determine the direction that Jesus would have us take in our lives? How do we recognize what voice is his, since it no longer comes in an audible human voice like it did for those first disciples? Preacher Roger Nishioka tells a story. He was speaking at a youth conference, and when the conference ended, a youth leader brought a young man forward, a teen. The teen started to cry, and he told Nishioka that he had been hearing the voice of God in his head for quite some time now, and that the voice of God was telling him to end his life, that the world would be better off without him. After talking with the young man for a while, and I'm hoping advising the youth leader to check into a psych eval. Anyway, after talking with the man for a while, Nishioka prayed with him as well. And then after the prayer, he told him that he didn't have any doubt that he was hearing a voice, but he could say with certainty that that voice wasn't the voice of God. He explained to the teen that he was valuable to God. God had created him in God's own image. God loved him. Friends, most of us aren't in a situation as dramatic as the one that Nishioka describes. But we do sometimes listen to the wrong voices. Voices that can cause us pain. Voices that can lead to destruction. Voices that can lead us astray down the wrong path. Right now in our nation, there are a lot of voices, a lot of angry voices, voices of envy and fear. But we've got to know that the voice of God speaks something very different to us, and that the call of Jesus leads us in a different direction. So now, how will we know for sure? Well, also in the Gospel of Matthew, just a chapter after Jesus calls the disciples, we read what a lot of people refer to as Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. It spans 3 chapters, from chapter 5 through 7. Now, if you have an interest in following Jesus, but you're struggling to discern his voice in your life, I would encourage you this week to take a few minutes and sit down and read that sermon, chapters 5 through 7. I promise you, it won't really take that long. But it makes remarkably clear the values, the attributes, the priorities of God. What Jesus proclaims in that sermon can be used as a sort of litmus test for us to determine whether or not what we're hearing and feeling in terms of God's guidance in our lives, to determine whether that's real. In that sermon, Jesus tells us what matters the most to God. Things like being gentle, showing mercy, pursuing peace, living from a posture of trust and not anxiety and fear, forgiving those who wrong us. Jesus calls us to follow him, and that call will look a little bit different for each of us because we're all unique, with unique gifts and talents and abilities. But that call will never lead us into actions or attitudes that conflict with what Jesus teaches in that Sermon on the Mount. Check it out for yourself this week in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. I'm Tracy Leslie, and this is my sermon on the Sermon on the Mount.